We've talked about multiple ways of connecting the skirt and the bodice together in a balanced way. In this one, you would have to combine them and adjust the dart and follow the written instructions in the book. I have already combined them into a set here. This was a draped set, and you have basic patterns for that if you want to start from there. If you're going to make a trench coat that has a waistband, you'll probably want to start with this one. I've got others that have waistbands that aren't trench coats, but the process is the same. In this one, we're going to do a princess line coat, and you can adapt it either way. But what I would want to start out by doing if I were making a coat is to make it a little bit larger. So decide on the amount that you want to offset. If you're working half scale, then I'm going to be using full scale measurements, so whatever numbers I give you, I would divide those in half. So I want to bring the side seam out and lower the armhole a little bit. And if I bring the side seam out a half an inch full scale, and I add up both side seams, that's going to be a total of 2 inches in the circumference. And I think I want 3 inches bigger, and maybe I'll smooth out the side seam just a little bit so it's not quite so tapered, but you don't have to do that. So I'm going to increase the size by 3 inches, which is going to mean I'm going to bring my line out 3/4 of an inch, and I think I'll lower my armhole by that same amount for this one. You can do more or less depending on the style and the look you want this to have. Okay, I extended out both side seams. I ended up using 5/8 of an inch instead of 3/4. I lowered the armhole, but I haven't dropped it yet because this line is going to be messy and I want to do that afterward. So I'm going to create my princess lines, and we wanted to leave some extra in the back armhole, so I'm going to start with that one because we'll end up leaving we might be doing something similar to the front armhole. So I'm going to start by moving this dart to the side and to the armhole. Okay, I've rotated my dart and I'm going to blend my armhole seam into it. Nope, I missed. Alright, this line would go to that part of the princess line and this line would go to the side body. If you want to add this into the armhole so that you've got extra space, you would just draw a straight line, but there, make sure it's nice and blended, and then treat this line, either of them, but this one will fit better, as just a flat seam, and ignore the extra line and just add seam allowance to both sides. So you would not end up using this line at all. You would just use that one and it would extend further down. Now with the armhole dart, you can just have extra in the back and not in the front. If you wanted to make this dart smaller by the same amount that you make the back dart smaller, I drew that line so I can measure it. So that's 0.43, so less than a half of an inch. If I wanted to add that space right there, and I'm just guessing right at the moment, but I could redraw that curve over to here, and there would be a released fullness, but you may still want to keep that dart. And since we're putting in a princess seam on the top, it won't hurt anything if we do. So you would want to draw Alright, I'm a little quirky about the way I do this. But you would want to draw your nice curved lines and blend them in with your dart. Oh, that shouldn't have been a curve. Okay. So because I moved this line over here, I'm actually going to change the shape of this dart. And I'm going to start from this one. So right here I put them close together, and we've talked about ease before. Right now I'm imitating paper, but if we were talking about using the Gerber system, you would want to move your dart point over so that you didn't lose any space. But this time we're going to move this over and we're approximating paper. But I am going to redraw this line so that it's joining here, and I'm going to delete some lines. Okay, so my dart ends at this level, so I want to keep my ease where the bust point, not where the dart point ends. So I just moved the top of my dart over to match that, and there's a different lecture that covers that. If you want to find it, it would have to do with creating a princess line, and it would be in the Gerber class. So now I'm just going to create a curve that blends into that so that it looks a little bit nicer. And this is something you would also do on paper. But we have probably talked about that. Okay, so this is my inside princess line and my center front and my side body. And I'm going to blend these, but I will have to come back and make sure that they're nice and cleaned up before I finish, because I'm just guessing on that line right there. I might have something messy. So that's what we're looking at right now. I've traced off my pieces, so my center front is here on that line, and I've traced off the side piece, and when I traced it, I went ahead and went with the lower armhole, but I left my markings on the piece so we could see it, and so we would know how much was added to the side. But that's how that fits in there. And then you would want to do the same thing, trace off the center back and the side back using the lower armhole and retain the lines that you need. But this center portion where the dart is gets thrown away like it is over here. That is no longer part of the pattern. That's where some of our fit is instead. So we have these two pieces. So I've traced off the back now. You can see that I ignored that second line, so these just join as if they have seam allowance and they're separate. But if I wanted to, I could come in and put that dart and trim off that one section. So we have our separate pieces. Okay, so there's a few things about this that I always make sure I do when I'm cleaning up a princess line. You can see here where I've got curved lines right here where they sew together. If I were to leave that as a sharp point like it is here and here, then when you breathe, the fabric is weaker than the thread, and it has a tendency to tear where you've got those sharp corners on a curved line. So I would always go in and use your curve and just barely bump it out so it's a nice smooth curve, and put the same curve on both sides, and you'll also want to blend that curve just slightly so that you don't get any little pointy errors. Then on the side seam, if you're thinking that you want to have this less fitted, you can pull it out, but just make sure that you line the pieces up and trace this line onto this piece and this line onto that piece, etc., so that they all match as you're sewing the seams together vertically. So that's how you would start, how you would add additional space. And we've talked about adding, if I lowered this 5/8 of an inch in the armhole, I'll just briefly go over that. If I want that to match my sleeve, I would redraw the sleeve cap. I would extend the sleeve cap up that amount rather than trying to lower it because it takes less time. So in the paper world, that would look more like that, and then you would just blend the dotted line into the solid line and throw that part away. Okay, so now we're going to start with the lapel. I think you pretty much know what to do with this to continue. You'll decide how long you want it to be and make it longer. You'll decide how much extra flare you're adding to each piece, and there's a number of ways to decide how far you want to do that. But if I were doing it right here, I would measure that amount and add that exact same amount all the way across the hem to each piece, going both directions. And I think there are skirt videos about added flare on a princess seam. Okay, lapel. So you will just need your front piece for that for now, and you might want to have looked at some coats. And don't forget to clean that up, but we're just talking about the lapel. Sometimes I will keep the front there just so that I've got the reference for how far I want my lapel to come out. On a blouse, you want to add an extension of 5/8. On a coat, you want to measure your button and give it at least 1/4 of an inch past half of the button. So I'm going to extend this out 3/4 of an inch instead of the typical 5/8 because it's a coat, but you can go more or less depending on your design. So your center front is inside now. You want to make sure and put a notch at the top and the bottom so that when it comes time to line things up, you know where that it will. You want to notch where the collar ends, and then you'll want a notch at the top and the bottom of the seam that gets folded if you do it on the fold. Okay, so to make your lapel, you want to draw where you want your collar to be, and you want to include that into the extension. So you don't want to draw your collar just to your center front, the lapel to your center front. It has to come out to the extension. So just decide where you want that to be, and when I'm working with this, I might want to have my back attached to it. While I'm thinking about what I want my collar and my lapel to look at, I want to include the back in that thought process, so I've put it nearby. And I can already see right here that this is not going to match properly, and I'm going to need to blend that. But we'll come back to that. Okay, so you want to choose your break point first. And it could come all the way to the waistline, but I'll come a little bit above that. And then you want to line this up with the edge of your neckline. I'm pulling it out here, but I'm looking right here, so watch what the line does right there. If this is my ruler, I'm going to set that line down right there where it actually touches the neckline. And it was easier to see that as a longer ruler space. So I will end up shortening that line, but that's my roll line. I thought through the way I wanted my collar to look, and I wanted it to be curved and kind of join with the collar that's coming around and back. And this isn't really how you make the back collar, but I like to include it in my thought process. So this part will be the part that folds, that becomes the lapel. And this part will be the part of the collar that joins it later when I make that. So that's the thought process. When you look in the book, they skip this step, and you draw a line from an inch out from the neckline to the lapel. And what that gives you is a roll space. This is the space that it takes the collar to roll over, and if you don't add that, then your collar doesn't come all the way out. The other thing that it does is that this part becomes this extension coming out here is the height of your collar stand. So if I were to make a separate collar stand for the collar that goes back here and it was going to be an inch tall, then I would make this an inch wide. So in theory, if your collar stand is going to be taller than that, then you would pull this out further. Okay, so we'll come back to the collar, but we've got our pieces on here, and so you don't get confused, I'm going to delete this line now. So I deleted that line and I used this as my fold line. So if you're in the book looking at lapels, it's going to show this extended line over here and the roll line. And you fold that back on top and you would trace off this line. So when it opens up, this is your lapel and it extends out to here, and you would blend a line between these two. Now, when I chose my line, I chose a line clear up here, and when I folded it, it extended clear out over here, and my neckline is back in there. If I were doing a bigger collar, I could maybe blend that in right there. But I want to keep it simple for you, so I'm going to use this line instead. So this part is my lapel, and this is the beginning of the thought process for the collar, the way the book explains it. And I have always found that a little bit frustrating, so I'm going to give you a simplified explanation for the collar that's an alternative to the way most of the books explain it. You can use the one that works the best for you. Here's the piece with the lapel attached. So the lapel is finished. This is what it looks like. You could blend that a tiny bit, but because of where it is, you don't necessarily have to. As sharp as that is, though, I would probably pull it out 1/16 of an inch and just curve that little bit and put a notch there. This is the under part of the body. This is the outside of the body of the center front, and this is the outside of the body of the center front that sews to it. And this folds back underneath. It folds back on top, but the lapel is the underneath side. And when we make the facing, so if this is wool and the lapel folds back over, this is the underside of the lapel, and it would be wool. And the next piece that we make would be the facing that becomes the visible part of the lapel. And if I were keeping it simple, I would just trace this section off. But if I were getting fancy under here, I might pull this back in a little bit so that there's less rolling space on the underside and more on the top, but I will address that when I make the facing as well. So we're just going to look at the facing. Well, the front, and we'll make it into a facing. So the thought process on the facing is that I don't want the seam allowance. The facing is going to sew to the body right here, and it's going to sew to the lining usually. We're not going to make a lined version of this. But if there were a lining being attached to it, I would want my facing to end before it got to that seam. Or, well, because I don't want as much bulk right there, I wouldn't want another seam allowance on top. So I'm going to create a line with a right angle right here that's going to be the same width as the back neck facing. And I'll make a line that's parallel to the center front that doesn't go closer than a half an inch to this line. Then I'll blend the two with a curve. I put a line 2 inches away from the inside of the neck so that my back neck facing can be 2 inches wide. And I used the squared edge of my ruler to square a line off. And I offset this line. And I'm going to blend those two together with a smooth curve so it goes through the serger better. You don't ever want to leave a sharp angle like I often see on commercial patterns. That doesn't sew together well. So 2 inches down to where you decide to end it. It looks like I combined mine with not the line I was planning on, so I'll adjust that, but you've got a nice smooth line there that's wide enough for your facing and 2 inches at the shoulder. So this is my facing outline. And you want to trace this off so that it's a separate piece. So you've got your front body, you're about to create your facing. Trace your front body onto a new piece of paper and add that line to it. There they are together, two separate pieces. The smaller one would be velvet and the larger one would be wool. They could be the same thing, but I'm saying it like that to help you keep straight in your head that this smaller piece ends up on the outside. Now I'm going to make this piece a little bit larger here so that when it gets sewn and rolls over, the seam won't show on the outside from the underneath piece. So I have added 1/4 of an inch extra full scale. If I were using a really, really heavy wool, I might add a little bit more than that, but that's a good place to start. And so when these two pieces sew together, you'll have to ease the larger one and the smaller one. You want these two corners to line up with each other exactly and then ease between, and that automatically causes the larger velvet piece to roll on top and the smaller underneath piece to roll inside so that you don't accidentally see the underneath part of the lapel. So that's your finished lapel, and I'm pretending it's velvet. Now we're going to look at the collar. You can continue the collar the way the book does and square the lines out and do all of the things and extend it and it crosses over. But in the end, what you want to have happen is a collar that has this shape, the shape that you've chosen. You want it to sew in to your lapel. So your lapel is going to need a notch right here, and I neglected to put that there, so I'll have to go back and put the notch on the lapel corresponding to where the collar ends. And it would be easier to show you with this one. So if I put that back in place, but I need to flip the piece over to do that. So it's sitting right there. I need to put my notch right there where the collar's going to join. And you want to make sure that it's precise. So now my collar eventually will sew to right there, and it's sitting right here. And I think that's why when I look at the book it confuses me, because you're flipping it back and forth and folding it over this line to create the collar. That's not the one I meant to move. Okay. So now when you're making your collar, if your collar's going to fold a certain amount, you want to make sure the width of the back of the collar, if it's extending an inch, it's going to be an inch plus another 1.25 inches at minimum, because your collar is going to extend up an inch and fold down, and you want it to cover itself. So I would measure down 2.25 inches and see how that blends into that line. So that is what the collar could look like. I know that's not the traditional way of doing it, but to be honest, I always drape my collars, so I would end up sewing a little test muslin together, and I would sew that part in, and then I would pinch out of the design line edge or add to it and lengthen or shorten it, and then I know I'm getting what I want. So that's where I start a collar. You're welcome to use a more traditional book method. And very likely, looking at this one in particular, it's not going to roll as much as I want it to. So that's why they would be having you extend this line out. So whatever that distance is, it would come out here, and then the next part of your collar would come out here and then blend in, because that's going to have a lot nicer roll line on it. So when you're following the book instructions, it's going to be the reverse image of that. But that's what it's trying to do, is create that straightness in the back so that it stands up straight and falls down. And the one that I did is too curved, but I used the shape that I wanted to blend in to my front collar. So you would just extend that, and the book explains that better. And with that collar, when you make your under collar, you'll do the same thing as I did on the lapel, and you will end up making this smaller. Or if you use this for the under collar, you end up making, this is going to be exact because it's going to sew into the lapel. Yeah, that squared version is going to look a lot more like what you want it to look like. But the same way that we extended this out 1/4 inch, you would extend this corner out 1/4 inch, and then your under collar would be 1/4 inch smaller all the way around to here and all the way up to here, and you would ease them in, and it would pull it so that it would sit underneath nicely. And I'm aware that this is the body and this is what the collar is actually sewing. Well, it's sewing to both. Your under collar will sew to the body, and your top collar will sew to the facing. And then when you're all through, you'll stitch around the edge and sew the body to the facing on the outer edge of the collar, and then fold it in. And if you're lining the coat, you will have sewn the lining to the facing part on the inside edge, so that when you flip this over, okay, so I've got my under collar that connects to the body, the center front, and my top collar that connects to the front facing. I've created my back neck facing. So the first thing I'm going to want to do before you sew your collar in, you want to sew your back neck facing to your front neck facing and your back shoulder to your front shoulder. And instead of sewing your collar together the way you normally think of sewing them together, you want to attach your collar, the two of them, to the pieces they go to first. You want to sew your collar and your facing together, and now these pieces won't lay flat, and it's a bit of a brain teaser. So you've got your under collar is cut too, and it's on the bias, and your top collar is on the fold, and it's cut 1. And you want to sew the undercollar together if that's what you're doing, but then you're going to line it up on the center back and sew it to that first notch so you can see where the necklines are lining up. And if you're using a more square collar, you're going to use the straighter one, more likely, the dotted line version, but this one's easier to see for sewing. So you would sew those two together, and then you'd have to do some clipping, but then you're going to continue sewing the piece around to that notch so that the collar lines up together, and at this point it's not laying flat anymore, and the collar can lay down and reverse. You'll have sewn the other one the same way, and then you'll pick them up and put them on top of each other, and if you sew this seam up here around the corner, turn around the corner, and then back along the edge of the collar and back down the other side, then it connects a lot easier, and that's the way you would sew a jacket. Without a lining. We could have another video on the lining if you want one.